Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to Sermon Preparation Workshop here from St. Martin in the Fields. And we are still in Advent and going to continue all the way up until Christmas. Sam, how are you? How are you getting on with Advent so far?
Yeah, I like Advent because I'm not a person to overstate things, and so Advent is definitely an understated season. Although when you've sung "Lo, He Comes" at full volume, that's a rather strange thing to say.
Yeah.
But it's definitely compared to Christmas a given to understatement. So our Advent Sunday services were beautiful and very inspiring, and will keep me going for a while. So thank you. How's Advent for you?
Oh, it's an exciting time, it feels, we've got lots of preparations for all our Christmas events and services and things. And so I'm looking forward to us preaching the gospel in dramatic ways at the
I
moment.
think it's fair to say that Richard's appetite for Christmas drama is ribald, and when you throw Jolly into the mix, it probably pushes him over the edge. So
It
I
sounds
think the combination of the two of you is irresistible.
yeah, it's definitely lots to look forward to this year, as always.
Yeah.
Sam, I wonder if I could ask you a piece of sort of practical advice for preachers
Hmm.
over the coming weeks, because you do get into December and sometimes a bit of a kind of grumpiness, or maybe a kind of, oh, it's Christmas, oh, I'm so busy, there's so much to do, how am I going to get through it all, kind of, and well founded, because it is a very busy time. But do you have any sort of practical advice for preachers about how to sustain the energy, the commitment, the joy, and all the things that might be involved in getting through to Christmas Day?
Well, I mean, it's a practical question, but it's a devotional answer, really, which is to say, and I know this sounds a bit pious, but I'm not usually accused of being a bit pious. So I think I get that opportunity occasionally. Um, I think the answer is to examine why you're feeling sluggish and why you're resistant. Um, and I talked in my sermon on Advent Sunday morning about disappointment. And, my hunch would be that your sluggishness is a fear that, it won't happen. And I think what won't happen uh, in simple terms for clergy in December is people won't volunteer and people won't show up. And I have written a couple of places about the experience I had in my first incumbency when I, leafleted the whole parish and got the congregation leaflet the whole parish because, of course, we're doing a midnight communion. You couldn't have Christmas without it. And then at 11:30, there was just me there.
Oh, wow.
And then after 2 minutes, a couple of people slunk in and said, "Are we the only ones?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm awfully sorry." And they said, "Oh, that's nice. That's what we were hoping." And I said, I was embarrassed and humiliated, really, but also humiliated because I'd insisted we have this service that nobody had had before and had no tradition in that community of having. So I only had myself to blame for being headstrong about it. In a classic case of the clergy person putting his own needs ahead of the parishes, understanding of the parish's dynamic. They said, yeah, we were both married to other people until recently, and I don't think they'd be pleased to see us, a lot of the churches in town. So we hoped that maybe you'd be quiet and we could just slip in. We thought we'd be sitting at the back, but if we're the only ones, that's just great. It was just...
Yeah.
So I think that's what people are sluggish about. They fear exactly the experience I had, that they'll bust a gut. And they won't, there will be no children at the children's Christingle or whatever their nightmare is. It'll be like that. And that may be past experience, or it may be just fear, or it may be not wanting to get their expectations up. But once you've examined those, then I think you can channel those. And you can be surprised, as I was surprised that night, that actually what seemed like a disaster was actually an epiphany. So
Very nice. Very pastoral response. Thank you. Appreciate that. Shall we jump into it? Shall we have
yeah,
readings then for Advent 3? Anything distinct about Advent 3 to consider before we look at
Well,
the...
yeah, I think this is actually the hard one in Advent because, the readings are saying John the Baptist, and nobody else in the world is saying John the Baptist. So that's what makes it hard. So you've got, but, if you're like St. Martin's and you've got a handful of carol services and whatnot between now and the end of December, mercifully, St. Martin's doesn't have a tradition of a post-Christmas Day carol service, as my first parish did, which I think is monstrous, but was the tradition there, and I kind of endured it for a few years. But anyway, in the next, fortnight or so, you may have 2, 3, 4, 5 occasions to say a few words about Christmas. So you might not be wanting to blow your cover all in one go and play all your aces at this service. But John the Baptist isn't exactly a bundle of laughs, and obviously he's the forerunner and he's predicting all sorts of things, but he's not very Christmassy, let's face it. Locusts and wild honey.
They're not on your Christmas menu?
Well, I can do either wild honey. I mean, I'm open to offers if people are sending it in, but locusts you can keep, I'm afraid. I don't have much use for them except in some sort of godly play presentation about Joel, which doesn't come round all that often. I mean, if someone sends me a jam jar of locusts saying, "I will restore to you the years the wild locusts have eaten," I would be quite moved, but don't all do that, please.
Address is in the no.
Exactly, that's right. Yes, yeah. Do not send glass. Get an adult to help you. Okay, so it's a tricky one to land, and that's where actually I'd be quite tempted here to go for the Isaiah reading.
Okay.
I don't think, frankly, you're going to go for the James reading. Let's be honest. But the Isaiah reading is one of those classic passages. It is clearly echoed in the Gospel, but it's one of those classic passages from Isaiah, not from Second Isaiah on this occasion. It's from First Isaiah, but it's possibly the most resonant passage in the whole of First Isaiah, apart from maybe Isaiah 2 or Isaiah 6, which is read on deaconings and things. It's beautiful. And anyway, so let's start there.
Yeah, tell us why.
And then we can pick up some of the same themes. So I would say, let's just imagine, I mean, this is a sort of theme that I take up perhaps more often than average, but let's pursue it anyway, because you're not me, and there's no reason why you have the same tendencies as I have. But let's imagine you've been through some kind of trauma, exile, disappointment, distress. I don't need to go into details, I don't think, but let's say you've been through a 2 or 3 year divorce and you're coming out of that, to take a fairly common example, regardless of the circumstances, or a lengthy terminal illness of a loved one, and which is finished at a death, and then you're a year or so on from it and trying to find your bearings again. I think this is for you. So to illustrate what I mean by that, I think you've got about 4 different dimensions to this passage. So the first is about the desert blooming. It might be a bit big to start with, but the wilderness and the dry land should be glad. I mean, I think you become blasé reading these kind of Old Testament passages, but these are people for whom there was fertile land, but there was also wilderness. And the idea that the wilderness should blossom was extraordinary. And the wilderness became a kind of synonym for exile. So the idea that good could come out of exile is also, I'm going to leave to the anoraks, whether this is a post-exilic passage that's sitting in first Isaiah. I mean, good luck to you if you want to go into that, but I don't think your congregation is terribly interested. They're interested in, this is life after death, basically. I think that's where you end the sermon. But where you begin it, I would say, is dividing this into roughly 4 sections. So the first one I would call something like vision. You will see the glory. You can sing the Julia Ward, How Mine Eyes Have Seen the Glory of the Coming of the Lord, if you like. That's an interesting one to sing in Advent. Desert shall rejoice, like the crocus. I mean, quite interesting to have that flower. But anyway, so here's your first idea about coming out, that you actually get a glimpse of glory. So the second one is, I would say, physical. Strengthen the weak hands. There's that beautiful anthem. If you've got a choir, I would imagine if I were preaching on this Sunday and the choir of St. Martin Fields were singing, then I would love that anthem. I can't honestly remember who wrote it now, but it's one of those classic early 20th century English anthems, all based on this passage. And then you've got this stuff that's a little bit difficult to navigate. I remember you navigated this very well once in a sermon here about disability, and that we wouldn't necessarily use motifs of disability. We'd use motifs of illness, and they wouldn't necessarily make the same distinctions in Isaiah's time. But this is clearly about different forms of bodily transformation. So if you say that going back to the beginning, the first couple of verses are about a glimpse of glory. The second couple of verses, strengthen the weak hands, are about being empowered. The next couple of verses, the eyes of the blind, 35:5, are about miracle transformation. And then you've got how that transformation translates into environmental transformation. Burning sand will become a pool. Haunt of jackals will become a swamp. And then you've got the next line will be called, is about the highway to Zion, holy way. Then you've got the lion, which I guess, if you like, well, actually, no, I don't think you need to relate that to the animal kingdom that we had in verse 7. I think that's a thing that connects with the highway. And then the ransom shall return. I mean, I think by that stage, you can call the sermon coming home if you like. But, I think by this stage, you expect your congregation to have tears in their eyes, really. It's over. The exile is over. We're coming home. Football's coming home. It's that kind of, finally, after all these years. Why does football's coming home still evoke a tear, even though it's sentimental nonsense? It's because that sense of coming home after a long exile is very powerful. It was there in the Dear England play about Gareth Southgate. Finally, it's coming home. So, I think for somebody coming out of exile, like a divorce or something like that, this can be an incredibly powerful reading. And I think it's really more about resurrection than incarnation. In a sense, it's more of a Lent, Lent or even Easter reading than a Advent and Christmas reading. But frankly, who cares if it's a sermon that's about resurrection? This is everybody's prayer.
Yeah.
In a sense, I think I would be ending by saying, whenever we lead intercessions in church, this is our prayer. This is a holistic vision for transformation, either for ourselves or for a person we care about, who's been through PTSD or ME or, one of these things that goes on a long time and leaves you powerless, and look at all the kind of holistic dimensions that this takes you through. And I think you just give little illustrations. Don't over illustrate a sermon like this. People can do their own work. I don't think it needs necessarily a single narrative that takes, that talks about Julie who had ME for all these years. I think people can do that for themselves with kind of half sentence illustrations, and just dwell on whichever of the verses really appeals to you. And yeah, I think in that sense, it's an easy sermon to write, and it's a beautiful one to hear.
Yeah, it is. It is. Very good. Okay, well, if that hasn't inspired you to preach on Isaiah, then we don't need to do the other two.
Exactly.
Let's do it anyway, and let's take a brief look at James.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, but just to dwell there for a moment in terms of what you're trying to achieve as a preacher, I think when you look at a passage like that, you're saying this could be a sermon that changes somebody's life.
Yeah, quite.
And you're saying, okay, I'm going to stay in those places. And I think anxiety, particularly from a new preacher or an experienced preacher, is trying to say too much. But in something like that, you don't need to do a laundry list of what coming out of exile means. The congregation know perfectly well whether it applies to them or a loved one, somebody they're thinking about on their heart. You just have to stay with the resonance of the feelings, like the word return in verse 10, like the word thirsty ground in verse 7, the word leap in verse 6, fearful heart. He will come.
Yeah.
They shall see the glory. I mean, there's so many really resonant, you just have to let those words speak, really. Don't overthink it.
Yeah.
Okay, James, less promising material. So, this is about patience. The word patience comes up 3 times in 4 verses. Mm-hmm. It's about patience. 4 times, actually. Twice in the first verse, once in the second verse, once in the last verse.
Yeah.
With a little bit of do not grumble. Yeah, I mean, it's the illustrations are fairly light and not particularly sharp. It's obviously based on the expectation of the return of Jesus. Now, I preached about that on Advent Sunday in the theme of disappointment, because obviously Jesus didn't come back, at least we assume it didn't come back in the form that was anticipated. I said a little bit about how Pentecost in some ways is a different kind of second coming. But, the clouds of glory from Daniel 7 clearly, well, we assume didn't happen because people might have noticed. So if you want to preach your big sermon about why did the second coming of Jesus not happen in biblical times, then you've got a verse there that you can pin that sermon on, and I think it's worth preaching that sermon from time to time. But you've got to have something to say. You can't just say, well, shrug your shoulders. Well, hard to know, isn't it? Amen. That's not helping anybody. So you've got to do some serious work on that and work out, word things like realized eschatology and stuff without using jargon like that. But that's what you're talking about. And I don't think there's enough sort of constructive material in this reading for it to say to me that's the right Sunday for that sermon.
And perhaps the best part of this this passage is the last verse, which says, "Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord," and that might just point you back to the Isaiah. Perhaps.
Yes. Yes. I mean,
all forwards to John.
Yeah. I think Isaiah can speak for himself, really. but I guess I find verses like that quite difficult because, which prophets is he talking about there? We don't really know. It's all part of the neither James nor Isaiah knew they were writing the Bible.
No.
So it's Intertextuality, as I'm sure you're aware, is the technical term for what
Mm,
we're
mm.
describing. One part of the Bible resonating with another. But yeah, I think you're not going to preach on James 5. I think, let's be honest.
I think it's
I mean, unless you really want to talk about patience. And, I did a sermon on disappointment for Advent Sunday. I think there is a sermon about patience. But the trouble about patience is it's a bit pious. Disappointment isn't pious. It's human, as it were.
yeah,
It's relatable. Whereas patience is a bit like saying, try a bit harder.
yeah,
Well, what's the
yeah.
use in that?
It's,
Um,
yeah.
so, I think that's a really hard territory for a sermon. Um,
Okay. Well, shall we go into the gospel then?
yeah. So, I mean, the gospel is really Isaiah 35 again. And I suppose this is, I don't know if people are familiar with Tom Wright. He's a very well-known biblical scholar who's written more books than I have. So there. And the reason for mentioning Tom here is that, in a sense, he's put his whole career on a theory, which I think is a good theory. Certainly when they articulated it in the 90s, I was very drawn to it, and I think it's kind of a bit like some things of Jürgen Moltmann and some other theologians of the late 20th century. It's become part of the water of what theologically trained people now mostly think. And what I'm saying is that Jesus's ministry was understood and portrayed by the gospel writers as a return from exile. And Tom's big thesis is that the for the Jerusalem temple up until the exile had the Ark of the Covenant, that's to say the container of the Ten Commandments, in it, and therefore are known as collectively as the mercy seat. And therefore, when sacrifices were made, people were confident that their sins had been forgiven. Whereas after the exile, when they returned from Babylon, when the temple was rebuilt, it didn't have the Holy of Holies because it didn't have it did have the Holy of Holies, but it didn't have the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, and therefore was that sense that sins weren't forgiven, and the exile wasn't really over. They were still ruled over by the Romans, and therefore they, it hadn't kind of worked. Neither the return from exile worked, nor the kind of forgiveness of sins that was kind of tied up with one interpretation of why they went into exile, and that Jesus came to, in a sense, complete the job. And his death on the cross was, if you like, the new mercy seat. And that's and so references like this are to the coming home from exile that Jesus fundamentally represented and would embody in his crucifixion and resurrection. So that's Tom's big thesis. I think it's a very good thesis. It's obviously not the same as my thesis because it's a for rather than with. But it's one of the best fors out there, and it's a whole lot better than most atonement theories. So I'm very sympathetic to it. Tom and I have certainly disagreed about other things, but on his most important contribution, I've got a lot of sympathy for it. Even though obviously we're in slightly different places on the big stuff. So this is a classic passage for that thesis. Because what Jesus says is he points to Isaiah 35, virtually quotes it when he says the blind receive their light, sight the lame walk, and so on. And basically says, well, look, the exile's coming to an end. So that shows you who I am. I mean, I did, I'm mentioning it for the fourth time in just half an hour, but I did preach this sermon about disappointment on Advent Sunday. And in a sense, you could preach that sermon on this Sunday because John is saying, there's the old joke that my neighbor at theological college used to take about, the mummy polar bear and the daddy polar bear and the baby polar bear, and the baby polar bear says to the mummy polar bear, am I a polar bear? And the Mummy Polar Bear says, well, I'm a polar bear. Your daddy's a polar bear, so you're a polar bear. And he says, why am I so cold then? And this is this is where you get that joke out, because John's saying, well, why am I in prison then? If you're the Messiah and
Yeah.
I'm the forerunner, what am I doing in prison?
Yeah.
Is this it? Are you the real deal?
Yeah.
And so Jesus, how, and of course that's such a significant story, a significant question, because that's what we're all asking about Jesus. That okay, I understand you're the one who is to come, but why is the Holy Land in a mess, and why is Ukraine still under Russian occupation, and why are Newcastle having such a poor season in the Premier League? So that's everybody's question. So it's it's a similar to the line that I was taking on Sunday, and this is Jesus' answer, which is, what did you want? Did you want exile to come to an end? Well, verse 5 is saying, what don't you understand? What part of this is difficult to understand? So again, I think that is a very pastoral sermon about what it feels like when the story doesn't turn out the way you thought it was going to, or particularly a sermon about kind of envy. I can see it's happening for other people, but it sure ain't happening for me. So I think for the person that's in a charismatic church and everybody seems to be slain in the spirit, and they're not having a great time, this is a good passage for a context like that.
Yeah.
I just don't get it. I understand everyone else is excited, but I'm afraid I just have to say I'm not. So that's where I would locate it. And I know obviously, an ideal sermon is both epic and lyric. That's to say, it's about the big picture, like I've just told the story of the Tom Wright's version of the gospel, and then it's about the lyric, which is my personal experience, my subjective, and that's John's in prison. So you can draw together that sense of and you can even go into a spiritual but not religious, because spiritual but not religious is basically saying it's happening for me, but I have no real notion or respect for the epic big picture, the church at large. I couldn't care less who the archbishop or the pope are. The church is all corrupt and irrelevant, and I'm not interested, but I do light a candle each evening and think about my parents. That I'm slightly caricaturing for the sake of time. And then there's the religious but not spiritual, which is, yes, I go to church, but it doesn't involve personal prayer or anything like that. So you've got those two kind of extremes, both of which are very recognizable to pretty much everybody there.
Yeah.
So I think you can explore that through this contrast between Jesus, who's saying it's happening, and John, who's saying it's not happening for me.
Yeah.
And I guess pastorally, you would end up saying, well, at different times in our life, we're on different sides of that divide.
Yeah. Amy has mentioned your disappointment sermon as well. I'm hoping, it'd probably be online.
It's online.
Hopefully, yes. So maybe Maddie might be able to find that and pop that in the chat for people if they haven't had a chance to read it, because it might, as you say, be helpful. I wanted to just ask one other quick thing about. Oh no, maybe we'll run out of time.
Go on.
Just a quick one. But there's the repetition of the question: what did you go out to see, or what? Is that what it says? What did you? Yeah. What then did you go out to see? And I wonder, is there a way of sort of, I guess, oratorically, is that the word? Kind of finding a way to use that in some way. It's kind of repeated in the passage. Is there a way that links into how you're describing the sermon, or is there something potential?
Yeah, it's not identical, is it? It's what
kind of develops.
You go in to look at, and then what did you go out to see? I haven't looked at the Greek.
And then it
I don't know if it's the same word or not. I assume it isn't.
It's not. Otherwise, they would. Yeah.
Yeah. But it'd be worth a look before you go big on that, because I've certainly gone big on words and found, got letters from people saying, I couldn't help but notice that you got two Latin words mixed up or something, which is funny, but also makes you feel a bit
Yeah.
sheepish.
I guess it's something about what is our expectation? What do in this time of waiting, and we're doing all these things for Christmas and for Advent and all that. I don't know. There's something like, what are you expecting?
Okay, no, I've got that wrong. There's what did you go out to look at? What did you out to see? What did you go out to see? We've got 3 of those. So, I think you're absolutely right. I think that is begging for that to be the title of the sermon.
Yeah.
And I think what that's saying, again, is by all means exegete the passage, but I think what that's begging for is for you to really work with those words, and a bit like a being with session tell about. You're asking to reflect on when they went out to see something. I remember being in Greece. I mean, I was not supposed to boast about my posh holidays. I was kindly entertained by a friend on a Greek island for a week, and during that week, the most massive boat I'd ever seen came past. Turned out to be owned by the Emir of Qatar, I think, or his prime minister, something like that. So that was one occasion when I went out to see something. So if I was in a being with group and I was asked, tell about a time you went out to see something, I'd probably talk about that. And then half an hour later, an equally large boat, which was his cousin's boat, came past the window, and they both parked in the bay. It was an unforgettable moment. So that reflecting on what it is to go out to see, because by nature, when you go out to see something, you think it's worth getting up. I mean, it happens to me a lot in my flat in Trafalgar Square, as you can imagine. It happens. There was a big tractor protest on the day of the budget, and I went out to see all the tractors in the square. I don't know if you were around that morning.
Yeah.
And it was quite a sight with all of them. So that, I think you can play with that, and I think you're absolutely spot on. And I think rhetorically, and a question like that, a brief question like that, can be very powerful. And I think you'd end by saying the good news is that in Jesus Christ, God went out to see you.
He's good. He is good, everybody. Very good. Thank you, Sam. Thank you for your insights as always. And thank you, everyone, for your contributions and questions and thoughts and discussion in the chat. It's always helpful and it's lovely to share this time with you. We'll wrap up there, but we will see you next week as we continue with Advent. Until then, bye-bye.